The late afternoon sun hammered down on the sage flats west of Bluebird Crossing with merciless intensity, turning the air into something thick and shimmering that made distances deceive the eye. Delson had been riding these freight routes for 23 days straight, his paint horse moving at a steady lope through draws choked with rabbit brush, and across stretches of hardpan where the alkaline dust rose in thin plumes behind his passing. The landscape stretched vast and empty, broken only by scattered mesquite and the occasional skeleton of a long-dead cottonwood, bleached white as bone by sun and wind. 23 days. 552 hours since he had picked up the first real lead in Tucson. But it was the 2 years before, that 730 days, that weighed heaviest on his chest, a physical ache that never quite left him. That was how long Winona had been gone. The memory came unbidden, sharp as broken glass. September morning, 2 years past. The Indian agent arriving at their camp in his government wagon with his papers and his false promises about education and opportunity in the East. Delson had been away hunting deer in the high country, and when he returned 3 days later, Winona was already gone, loaded with 11 other Apache children into a wagon bound for destinations unknown. His cousin had told him how Winona had fought, how she had screamed his name, how she had pressed her hand through the gap in the canvas as the wheels carried her away. Delson had run after them, following the tracks for 2 days, until his horse went lame and he had to turn back or die of thirst in the desert. But before he turned back, he had gotten close enough to see the wagon one last time. Close enough to see Winona's hand still reaching through the canvas, close enough to see her dark eyes find his across the distance, and close enough for the agent's assistant to spot him and fire a warning shot that became something more when Delson kept coming. The rifle butt to his ribs had knocked him down, and by the time he could breathe again, the wagon was gone, swallowed by dust and distance. She had been 14 then, old enough to understand what was happening, but too young to fight it effectively. The agent had called it relocation for education and cultural advancement. Delson called it what it was: theft of children sanctioned by the government. He had promised their dying mother, promised on her deathbed, as fever consumed her, that he would keep Winona safe. That promise haunted every mile he rode, every cold camp, every dead-end trail. It sat in his chest like a stone, growing heavier with each day that passed without finding her. He had tried the official channel's first letters to the Bureau of Indian Affairs that went unanswered visits to military posts, where officers told him to go back to the reservation and forget that it was done and could not be undone, that his sister was being educated and civilized, and he should be grateful. But Delson could not forget, would not. Winona was the only family he had left after the fever took their parents in the winter of 1851, and he would search until he found her or until his own bones joined the bleached wood scattered across this unforgiving land. The whispers had started 3 months ago. A freight handler in Tucson, drunk and loose-tongued after Delson had bought him 4 whiskeys and listened patiently to his rambling stories, had mentioned women and children who vanished off the western routes, not killed in raids, but taken, moved, sold to places where labor was cheap and questions were never asked. When Delson pressed him with more whiskey and a few coins, the man's face had gone pale with sudden fear, and he had refused to say more, backing away, with hands raised as if warding off a curse. But it was enough. Delson had ridden north, shadowing the supply wagons that rolled toward Phantom Ridge Mine, watching for patterns in the traffic that crossed this vast, empty territory. Now cresting a low rise above a stretch of open prairie, he saw smoke. It was not the clean gray column of a campfire or the black billow of a locomotive. This was the thin, greasy curl of violence, already finished, already dissipating in the hot wind. Delson's gut clenched, with a familiar dread, the same sick twist he had felt watching Winona's wagon disappear into the desert's shimmer. He touched his heels to the paint's flanks and sent the horse down the slope at a hard gallop, hooves drumming the packed earth sage branches, whipping at his legs. The scene crystallized as he closed the distance. A freight wagon tilted at a broken angle near a weathered ranch gate, its canvas top torn and flapping like a broken wing in the wind. Two mules lay tangled in their harness necks, twisted at unnatural angles, flies already gathering in black, buzzing clouds that rose and settled with every gust of wind. Blood had soaked into the dust beneath them, turning it dark and sticky, already baking hard in the fierce heat. Trunks had been ripped open and gutted, their contents scattered across the hard-packed earth in a chaos that spoke of violence and haste. Calico dresses trampled into the dirt and torn books with pages ripped out and fluttering in the breeze. A child's wooden blocks scattered like dice, a shattered music box, with its tiny dancer frozen mid-pirouette, one delicate porcelain arm snapped clean off. The wheel ruts and hoofprints told the story plainly if you knew how to read them, and Delson had been reading tracks since he was old enough to walk. 4 riders, maybe 5, had come fast from the east. The attack had been quick and efficient, the kind of work done by men who knew exactly what they wanted and how much time they had to take it. Boot prints showed where the driver had been dragged from his seat or had fallen after being shot. Dark stains on the wagon bench confirmed what Delson already knew. The man had died here, bled out on wood that still showed the marks of his hands clawing for purchase as life left him. The women had been dragged down from the wagon bed. One had fought. Her boot prints showed a confused struggle near the rear wheel, the marks overlapping and sliding where she had tried to break free or been knocked down repeatedly. Another set of smaller prints, a child's, led to the fence post, and then stopped, as if the child had been paralyzed by fear or had hidden and stayed hidden. Then the riders had turned west, moving fast toward the railroad line that ran parallel to the base of the distant mountains. 4 horses going out, same as coming in. But the tracks were deeper on the return journey, pressed harder into the earth. They had been carrying extra weight, the women bound and helpless. Delson pulled the paint to a halt and swung down his hand, moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. His eyes swept the wreckage with the trained awareness of a scout cataloging every detail, looking for threats before looking for survivors. The attackers were long gone. Their tracks led west toward the distant line of the railroad, already blurred by the wind that swept constantly across these flats. But something moved near the gate. A little girl knelt beside a barbed wire fence post, driven into the ground at the gate's edge, her small body rigid with a peculiar stillness that comes after shock has drained away the capacity for movement. She could not have been more than 7 thin as a willow switch in a faded blue dress that was too large for her frame. The sleeves rolled up multiple times and still hanging past her wrists. Her brown hair hung in tangled strands around a face streaked with dust and tears that had carved clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. In one hand, she clutched a cloth doll with button eyes and a stitched smile. In the other, a small wooden horse with chipped paint, its red color faded to pink by sun and handling. When Delson approached Boots crunching on the gravel, she looked up. Her eyes pale gray like winter sky, fixed on him with an intensity that seemed too old for her small face. She saw the eagle feather tucked into his hatband, the dark braids framing his face, the bow and quiver strapped across his back, the beaded belt at his waist. She saw everything the stories had taught her to fear about Indians on the frontier, the savage, the killer, the scalper, the monster that white mothers invoked to frighten children into obedience. But she did not scream. She did not run. She simply stared, her breath coming in shallow, hitching gasps that shook her thin shoulders, her knuckles white where she gripped the toys. Then she did something that froze Delson in place and would haunt him for the rest of his life. She pushed herself to her feet, on trembling legs that barely held her weight, and shoved both toys at his chest with all the desperate strength her small arms could muster. The doll hit his shirt with soft impact. The wooden horse pressed against his ribs hard enough that he felt it through the fabric. Her voice, when it came, was raw and hoarse, scraped thin by crying and screaming and fear. I'll give you all my toys." She whispered the words, tumbling out in a frantic rush that barely paused for breath. "Just bring my mama back. Please, please, mister. I'll give you everything. All my toys, this doll and the horse and the blocks over there and everything. Just bring her back. Please don't hurt her. Please bring her back to me." The word struck Delson like a physical blow, harder than the rifle butt that had knocked him down 2 years ago, harder than anything he had felt since watching his mother die. He had seen cruelty before, had witnessed the casual violence of men who viewed other human beings as obstacles or property to be moved or disposed of without thought or conscience. But this simple, terrible bargain offered by a child cut through him like a blade reopening wounds that had never quite healed. She was trying to negotiate for her mother's life with a doll and a wooden horse, because in her small, shattered world, those were the only things of value she possessed, the only currency she had to trade for the thing that mattered most. He knelt slowly, bringing himself to her eye level, and let his hand rest gently on the top of her head. Her hair was gritty with dust and sweat tangled with bits of sage and grass. She flinched at the contact, but did not pull away her gray eyes, searching his face with desperate hope mixed with bone-deep terror. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice low and steady, the tone he had once used to calm frightened horses or injured animals. "Daisy." She whispered, her lower lip trembling so hard her words came out shaky. "Daisy Koenig. Please, mister. Please help me. I don't have nobody else." "I am Delson. Where is your mama, Daisy?" Fresh tears welled up and spilled over, carving new tracks through the dirt on her cheeks, leaving her face streaked with muddy lines. "The men took her. They had bandanas on their faces so we couldn't see who they were, and they shot Mr. Hobbs right off the wagon seat, and he fell and didn't get up, and there was blood everywhere, and they tied Mama's hands with rope behind her back and pulled her onto a horse, even though she was kicking and fighting and trying to get away. And she told me to hide. She said, 'Hide under the wagon, Daisy, and be quiet and don't come out no matter what you hear,' and I did like she said. But they rode away and left me here all alone." Her voice cracked on the last words, dissolving into a sob that shook her whole body, making her thin shoulders heave. "Why did they leave me? Why didn't they take me with Mama? I want my Mama." "Because you were worthless to them," Delson thought but did not say. "Because a child was too much trouble, too easy to track, too likely to slow them down or cry at the wrong moment. Because these men were in the business of taking women who could work or be sold, not children who needed care and feeding." Instead, he asked, keeping his voice gentle despite the cold rage building in his chest, "Did you see which way they went? Can you show me?" She pointed west with one small finger, her hand shaking badly. "Toward the mountains. The big ones with snow on the tops. They rode really fast, and Mama was screaming my name, and I wanted to come out. But she said, 'Don't come out,' and I was scared, and I didn't know what to do. So I just stayed hidden until everything was quiet, and then you came." She looked up at him with those devastating gray eyes. "Are you going to help me, or are you going to hurt me like the stories say Indians do?" "I am going to help you," Delson said firmly. "The stories are wrong about many things." He rose to his feet and moved to the wagon, his eyes scanning the ground with practiced precision. The story was written in the dust, clear as ink on paper, if you knew how to read it. And Delson had been reading such stories his entire life. The writers had been methodical in their violence. They had stopped the wagon here at the gate, where the road narrowed, and there was no room to maneuver around them, forcing the driver to halt. They had shot the driver from his seat. Delson could see the dark stain on the wooden bench already baked dry and black by the sunflies crawling over it. The women had been dragged down from the wagon bed. One had fought hard. Her boot prints showed a confused struggle near the rear wheel, the marks overlapping and sliding where she had tried to break free, where she had been knocked down, where she had tried to rise again. Blood drops formed a trail toward where the horses had stood. Then the riders had turned west, moving fast toward the railroad line that ran parallel to the base of the distant mountains. 4 horses going out same as coming in, but the tracks were deeper on the return journey, pressed harder into the earth by extra weight. They had been carrying the women bound and helpless. This fit the pattern he had been tracking for weeks, raids on freight wagons, carrying women alone or with children disappearances that left no bodies and no witnesses, except the ones too young or too frightened to be believed. This was not random violence by desperate bandits looking for quick money. This was business organized and efficient, run by men who knew what they were doing and had done it many times before. In the splintered wreckage of one trunk, half buried under torn dresses, Delson found a document that made his pulse quicken. A contract from Mercury Falls Bridal Company promising land and a husband to one Alice Koenig widow, age 28, of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The contract listed her destination as Mercury Falls, a town Delson had passed through once, and found to be little more than a collection of abandoned buildings and broken dreams. "Are you going to help me find Mama?" Daisy asked behind him, her voice barely above a whisper, small and broken. "Or are you going to take my toys and leave me too?" Delson turned to face her. He knew what she saw when she looked at him, a warrior from the stories white settlers told their children to keep them obedient and afraid, stories of savages who scalped innocents and burned homesteads and stole children in the night. He was everything her short life had taught her to fear. But he also saw the desperation in her pale gray eyes, the raw hope that had not yet been crushed by the world. And beneath that, he saw Winona, 14 years old, pressing her hand against canvas, her fingers stretching toward him as the wagon carried her away into dust and distance and silence that had lasted 2 long years. He crouched again and met Daisy's gaze directly, holding it so she would know he meant every word he was about to say. "I will follow the men who took her. As long as I can find their tracks, I will not stop. That is my promise to you, Daisy Koenig. I promise on my mother's grave and on my sister's name that I will find your mama and bring her back to you." It was the only promise he could give her, and it was the truth. But it was also more than that. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a connection was forming, a pattern he had been chasing for months, finally taking shape. If Winona had been taken the same way, moved along the same routes, sold to the same places by the same people, then finding this woman might lead him to his sister. The thought sent a surge of desperate hope through his chest, painful and sharp and terrifying in its intensity. Daisy nodded slowly, her small face set, with a fragile kind of courage that reminded him so much of Winona it hurt to look at her. She did not offer her toys again. She simply stood beside him, clutching them to her chest like talismans as he lifted her into the saddle of his paint horse. Her fingers gripped the leather with white-knuckled determination, and she did not look back at the wreckage or the dead mules or the blood-stained wagon as Delson swung up behind her. He settled his arm around her waist, feeling how thin she was, how her small body trembled against his chest like a frightened bird, and turned the horse west toward the fading dust of the men who had stolen her mother. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood. Shadows stretched long across the prairie like grasping fingers, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, sharp and lonely and hunting. He had not arrived by chance. He had been hunting this trail for weeks, driven by a promise made to a dying mother and the ghost of a sister who might still be alive somewhere in this vast, indifferent land. And now, with the weight of a child's trust pressing against his chest and the scent of smoke and blood still hanging in the air, the hunt had become something more than duty or even love. It had become personal, in a way that made his hands tighten on the reins and his jaw clench with determination that bordered on obsession. He would follow the trail. He would find Alice Koenig, And maybe, just maybe, he would find Winona too. The paint horse moved west at a steady lope, carrying them toward the mountains and whatever waited there. The ride west was hard and fast and desperate. Delson kept the paint at the edge of what the animal could sustain, one eye on the horizon and the other on the ground, reading the tracks the way other men read books. They were clear at first, 4 horses moving at a gallop, hooves cutting deep marks in the soft dirt near the wagon. But as the land turned rocky and the wind picked up, sweeping across the open flats with nothing to stop it or slow it, the trail began to fade like a story being erased before he could finish reading it. Edges blurred. Details vanished into the general texture of stone and dust. Daisy sat rigid in front of him, her back straight as a lodgepole pine, her small hands knotted in the horse's mane so tightly her knuckles had gone white as bone. She had stopped crying, but her breathing was quick and shallow, and Delson could feel the tension vibrating through her small frame like a tightly wound wire about to snap. She flinched at every sound, the sudden cry of a hawk wheeling overhead, in lazy circles the rattle of stones dislodged by the horse's hooves, and bouncing down slopes the distant rumble of thunder, building in the mountains ahead where dark clouds gathered. "You did well to stay quiet when your mama told you," Delson said, after they had ridden for perhaps an hour, his voice cutting through the rhythm of the hoofbeats and the wind. "That kept you safe. That was smart thinking for such a little girl." Daisy did not answer right away. Then, in a small voice that trembled at the edges like a candle flame in wind, she said, "Mama told me being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. She said it just means you do what you have to, even when you're scared. Even when you want to cry and run away and hide forever." "She is right," Delson said quietly. He meant it. He had learned the same lesson watching Winona disappear, learning to keep moving even when his heart felt like it was being torn from his chest, even when every instinct screamed at him to give up because the world was too big and too cruel, and one man could not fight it alone. "And you were brave. Very brave." "I want my mama," Daisy whispered so quietly he almost did not hear it over the wind and the hoofbeats. "I want her right now. I want to go home, but we don't have a home anymore, and I'm scared, and I don't know what's going to happen." "I know," Delson said, and there was nothing else to say that would not be a lie or a false comfort. He could not promise her everything would be all right, because he did not know if it would be. He could only promise to try, and sometimes that had to be enough. They rode through the late afternoon as the sun sank lower and the shadows grew longer, the landscape shifting around them as they moved from open prairie into broken ground, laced with arroyos and dotted with mesquite and juniper. The air smelled of sage and dust and the approaching storm, and the temperature began to drop as clouds moved in from the west. The sun hung low and red through the haze, casting long shadows that stretched across the earth like dark rivers flowing east. Delson followed the tracks west along the base of a low ridge, his instincts sharp and honed by years spent reading the land, and the stories it told in hoofprints and broken branches and the way grass bent and recovered. But he was not the only one reading the land that afternoon. As they crested a rise overlooking a shallow valley, movement caught his eye on the far side, dust rising in a thin line, horses moving fast, the glint of metal catching the dying light. His gut clenched with sudden alarm. He reined in sharply and swung the paint behind a cluster of boulders, his hand moving to cover Daisy's mouth before she could make a sound. "Don't make a sound," he whispered urgently against her ear, feeling her small body go rigid with fresh fear beneath his hand. "Not one sound, no matter what you see or hear. Do you understand me?" She nodded against his palm, her breath coming fast and hot against his skin, her whole body trembling. The riders came into view moments later, 5 men moving at a hard gallop along the ridge opposite, their silhouettes sharp against the red sky. They wore no badges, no uniforms that Delson could see, but the rifles across their saddles and the grim, purposeful set of their faces as they scanned the landscape told him everything he needed to know. A posse. Someone in Bluebird Crossing must have seen the smoke from the burning wagon or heard about the attack, and now they were hunting. They would find the wreckage, the dead mules, the scattered belongings, and they would assume the worst. An Apache scout carrying a white child would be all the evidence they needed to form a lynch mob, all the justification they needed to shoot first and ask questions later, if at all. Delson's mind raced through options with the speed born of desperation and long experience with being hunted. He could try to hide here among the boulders, wait for them to pass, but the paint's tracks were clear in the soft earth behind them, and these men knew how to follow sign. Even if they did not see the tracks, they would search every cluster of boulders, every depression in the land. He could try to talk to explain what had happened, but words would not matter to men who had already decided he was guilty. The only real option was to run and run fast and hope the gathering darkness would hide them before the posse closed the distance. He urged the paint forward, keeping to the low ground, using the folds of the land to stay out of sight as much as possible. But the posse was faster than he expected, their horses fresher, their numbers greater, their determination fueled by righteous anger and the satisfaction that comes from hunting something considered dangerous. A shout rang out from the ridge, sharp and angry, followed by the flat crack of a rifle. The bullet whined past close enough that Delson felt the air split beside his head. With a sound like tearing cloth, felt the wind of its passage. Daisy yelped a small, frightened sound that was almost lost in the sudden thunder of hooves as the paint bolted. The horse scrambled for purchase on the loose shale muscles bunching and surging beneath them with desperate strength. Delson leaned low in the saddle, one arm locked around Daisy like an iron band and the other gripping the reins as he drove the horse down the slope toward a line of cottonwoods, marking the course of a creek. More shots followed, the reports echoing off the hills like the crack of a whip or the sound of breaking bones, each one making Daisy flinch against his chest. The posse was closing fast, their shouts carrying on the wind, angry voices calling for him to stop calling him murderer and savage and kidnapper, and worse things he had heard before and would hear again. Delson knew he could not outrun them on open ground, not with Daisy's extra weight, not with his horse already tired from a day's hard riding. His only chance was to reach cover and lose them in the broken terrain along the creek. Use the failing light and his knowledge of the land to disappear. The cottonwoods rose up ahead, their branches heavy with late summer leaves that rustled and whispered in the wind, like voices warning of danger. Beyond them, clear in the still air, Delson could hear the rush of water. The creek was running high from recent rain somewhere in the mountains, swollen and fast and cold. He pushed the paint toward it, feeling the animal's muscles bunch and surge beneath him, the horse's breath coming in great heaving gasps that he could feel through the leather saddle. They hit the water at a full gallop, spray flying up in silver sheets that caught the last light. The current was stronger than Delson had anticipated, cold as mountain snow, and pulling hard at the horse's legs like living hands trying to drag them under. The paint stumbled, front legs buckling as the riverbed dropped away suddenly into deeper water, and Daisy slipped from his grip with a terrified cry that cut through the sound of rushing water. She went under the current, taking her the water closing over her head with barely a splash. For one terrible moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Delson could not see her, could not hear her over the roar of water and the shouting behind them. Panic seized his chest. Then his hand shot out blindly, fingers grasping at nothing, and then something fabric wet and heavy. He closed his fist and hauled upward with all his strength, the wet cloth tearing in his grip, but holding long enough for him to drag her against his chest. She came up coughing and gasping, water streaming from her hair and nose, her eyes wide with shock and terror, and the pure animal panic of drowning. A bullet smacked into the water behind them with a sharp crack, sending up a gout of spray that soaked them both. Delson kicked the paint forward, shouting at the animal, forcing it to lunge through the current toward the far bank. The horse's hooves found solid ground, and they scrambled up the muddy slope into the shelter of the tree's branches, whipping at their faces and tearing at their clothes, leaves shredding and swirling around them in the wind. Behind them, the posse reached the creek. Delson could hear their shouts growing louder, the frustrated curses as their horses balked at the swollen water, out the angry debate about whether to cross here or circle around to find a better ford. He did not wait to see what they would decide. He spurred the paint deeper into the cottonwood grove branches, clawing at his arms and face and drawing blood, and rode hard through the gathering darkness until the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance and the night. Only then did he slow his heart, hammering in his chest like a war drum, calling him to battle, his breath coming hard and ragged, and check Daisy. She was soaked and shivering, her lips tinged blue from the cold water, her teeth chattering so hard he could hear them clicking together. But her eyes were clear and focused, and she was alive. She looked up at him, water dripping from her chin, her tangled hair plastered to her skull like dark seaweed. "I didn't let go of my doll," she said through chattering teeth, her voice fierce despite the cold. "I held on tight like you said to hold on to things that matter. The horse is gone, but I still have my doll." Delson glanced down and saw the cloth doll still clutched in her hand, its button eyes staring blankly, its body sodden and dripping creek water, one arm hanging by a thread. The wooden horse was gone, lost to the current, and probably miles downstream by now. Despite everything, the fear, the pain in his ribs, where the current had slammed him against a submerged rock, the knowledge that they were being hunted by men who would kill them without hesitation, he felt a flicker of something close to respect and admiration for this small, stubborn child who had already lost so much. "Good," he said, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "That was very good, Daisy. You did exactly right. Hold on to it and hold on to me. We need to keep moving." They rode through the gathering dusk as the sky turned from red to purple to deep blue, scattered with the first stars appearing one by one like distant campfires. Delson followed the creek upstream into rougher country, where the land rose in broken terraces and the air smelled of sage and pine resin and the approaching storm. By the time full dark fell, stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt, and the moon rising pale and thin, he had guided them to a narrow bend in the Rio Verde, where the water ran quiet and deep between banks lined with willows that bent and swayed in the wind. Hidden among the trees, sheltered from the wind, and invisible from any trail, was a small camp. 2 simple brush shelters leaned against the bank, their frames woven from willow branches and covered with hides and canvas salvaged from abandoned wagons. A cook fire had been banked low, the coals glowing red in the darkness like the eyes of some sleeping creature. The smell of drying meat hung in the air, mixing with wood smoke and the clean scent of the river. 3 figures rose as Delson rode in silhouettes against the fire, moving with the wary caution of people who had learned not to trust sudden arrivals in the night. The first was a woman near his own age, lean and sharp-eyed with black hair, bound in a single thick braid that hung to her waist and swayed as she moved. She wore a buckskin shirt and trousers practical and worn from hard use, and a knife gleamed at her belt in the firelight. This was Nayeli, his cousin, who had followed him from the reservation when he refused to stop searching for Winona. She had lost her own sister to the fever 5 years ago, and she understood the weight of promises made to the dead, the way they sat on your chest at night and made it hard to breathe, made it impossible to rest until you fulfilled them or died trying. "You brought trouble," she said flatly, as Delson dismounted, her sharp gaze flicking to the soaking wet white child, and then back to her cousin. Her voice carried no judgment or surprise, just statement of fact, born of long experience. "Trouble found me," Delson replied shortly. He reached up and lifted Daisy down from the saddle, feeling how she trembled against him, how her small fingers clutched at his shirt as if afraid he might disappear too if she let go. The second figure stepped forward into the firelight, a white man in his 50s, his hair gray and thinning at the crown, his face lined with exhaustion that went deeper than physical weariness, the kind that came from seeing too much suffering and being unable to stop it. Dr. Emmett wore clothes that had once been fine, but were now worn and patched in multiple places, and he carried himself with the careful posture of a man whose back had been broken and healed crooked. He had been a Union surgeon during the war assigned to field hospitals where boys younger than Winona screamed and died on blood-slicked tables, while he cut off their shattered limbs and dropped them in growing piles outside the surgical tent. The horrors he had witnessed, the rivers of blood, the mountains of severed arms and legs, the faces of boys calling for their mothers as they bled out, had driven him west after Appomattox in search of something he could never quite name or find. Peace, maybe. Or atonement for all the ones he could not save. Or just distance from the memories that woke him screaming in the night. He took Daisy from Delson without a word, his movements gentle despite their efficiency, and wrapped her in a dry blanket with the practiced care of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. He began checking her for injuries with brisk precision, feeling her limbs for breaks, looking into her eyes, for signs of concussion, pressing his fingers against her ribs to check for tenderness or fractures. She went under in the creek. Delson said, his voice tight. Swallowed some water, but I got her out fast. Did you cough up water? Emmett asked Daisy gently, his voice calm and professional. She nodded, still shivering violently despite the blanket. A lot. It tasted bad. Good. That's good. Means your lungs are clearing. You're going to be fine, little one. He continued his examination with methodical care, checking her ears and throat, listening to her breathing. The third figure hung back in the shadows, just beyond the firelight, a boy perhaps 10 years old, stick-thin and silent with wide, dark eyes that watched everything and missed nothing, that saw too much and showed too little. No one knew his real name. He had been found wandering alone near the ruins of a burned homestead 6 months ago, covered in ash and blood that was not his own, unable or unwilling to speak. The other children at the reservation had called him Wolf Child because he moved like something wild and untamed, always on the edge of flight, never quite trusting anyone enough to come fully into the light. He appeared now at Daisy's side with a tin cup of water, his movements quick and cautious as a coyote approaching a trap, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Daisy took the cup with both small hands and drank slowly, her eyes never leaving the boy's face. He stared back, unblinking, his expression unreadable. Then he vanished into the shadows as silently as he had come, leaving barely a footprint. Nayeli crossed her arms, her expression hard in the flickering firelight. There will be a posse, maybe more than one, and they'll be looking for an Apache with a white child. You've painted a target on all of us, cousin. Every man in that posse will shoot first and feel righteous about it after. I know, Delson said shortly. He unsaddled the paint and began rubbing the animal down with a handful of dry grass, his movements automatic, his mind racing ahead to what came next. His shoulder ached where something, a branch or a rock in the creek, had struck him, and his ribs were bruised from the scramble through the water, each breath sending a sharp pain through his side. But he ignored it all. There would be time to rest later. Maybe. I had no choice. The men who attacked the wagon took her mother. If I had left her there, she would have died of thirst or been eaten by coyotes before anyone else came. We should move camp, Nayeli said, her voice carrying an edge of urgency that bordered on desperation. Tonight, now. Put distance between us and that town before they organize a proper search party with dogs and torches and enough guns to wipe us all out. No, Delson said firmly, not looking up from his work on the horse. The child needs warmth and food and rest. She nearly drowned. We move at first light, not before. In darkness, we might ride into an ambush or lose the trail completely. Delson. Nayeli started, her voice rising with frustration. At first light, he repeated his tone, leaving no room for argument, carrying the weight of final decision. Not before. If you want to leave now, cousin, then leave. I will not stop you or think less of you for choosing to survive. But I am staying with the child until she is strong enough to travel. Nayeli opened her mouth to argue, saw the set of his jaw and the look in his eyes, the same look he had worn when he announced he was going to search for Winona no matter what anyone said, and closed her mouth again with a snap. She turned away, muttering something under her breath in Apache that Delson did not catch and probably did not want to hear anyway. Emmett carried Daisy to the fire and set her down on a flat rock that had been positioned near the coals to absorb heat during the day and radiated back at night, wrapping the blanket more tightly around her thin shoulders. The heat from the fire made steam rise from her wet clothes and hair curling up into the cold night air. She huddled there, still shivering despite the warmth, her face pale and drawn in the flickering light that cast dancing shadows across her features. Wolf Child appeared again like a ghost, materializing from darkness this time with a piece of dried meat on a tin plate, offering it to her, with a gesture that was almost shy, almost tentative, as if he expected her to refuse or strike him. She took it carefully, her small fingers brushing his, and chewed slowly, mechanically, as if she had forgotten what hunger felt like or how to satisfy it. Delson crouched beside her after finishing with the horse, his movements slow and careful so as not to startle her. Up close in the firelight, he could see how exhausted she was, how her eyes kept trying to close and her head kept drooping forward before she jerked it back up. But there were things he needed to know, questions that could not wait until morning. Daisy, I need you to tell me everything you remember about what happened today, he said gently, keeping his voice low and calm. I know it's hard to talk about. I know it hurts to remember. But I need to know everything if I'm going to find your mama. Can you do that for me? She nodded slowly, her small face pale and drawn with exhaustion and trauma. Start from the beginning. Where were you coming from? Where were you going? Daisy's voice was thin but steady when she answered the words, coming slowly at first and then faster, tumbling over each other, as if saying them aloud helped make sense of the chaos and horror. We came all the way from Pennsylvania, from Harrisburg. That's where we lived before Papa died last winter. He was a farmer, but then he got sick with the lung fever and the doctor couldn't help him. And he died right before Christmas, and we didn't have any money left after paying for the medicine and the funeral. The bank took the farm back because we couldn't pay, and Mama said we had nowhere to go and no way to live, and I was scared we were going to starve or freeze. She paused to take a shaky breath, her hands twisting the blanket. Then Mama saw an advertisement in the newspaper that someone left at the church. It said there were men out west who needed wives, because there weren't enough women, and they would give us land and a house and a new start, and everything would be better, and we wouldn't be hungry anymore. The company was called Mercury Falls Bridal Company. They sent us papers to sign and train tickets and a letter saying everything was arranged and we should come right away. Emmett exchanged a significant glance with Delson across the fire, his expression grim in the flickering light. Mail-order brides, he said quietly, his voice heavy with knowledge of how such things often ended. It's common enough these days, especially after the war left. So many women widowed, and so many men out here without families or prospects. Most of the companies are legitimate operations, matching lonely people who might otherwise never find companionship. Most of the women actually reach their destinations and live ordinary lives, get married, have children, grow old together. But not all. Some of the companies are fronts for something darker. Not these ones. Delson said, his voice flat and hard as stone. Not Mercury Falls. He turned back to Daisy, his expression gentling. What happened on the road? Tell me everything you remember, even the small things that might not seem important. Sometimes the small things matter most. We took the train west as far as the tracks go, then got on a wagon in a town I don't remember the name of. Daisy continued, her voice growing shakier as she approached the traumatic parts of the story. We were with two other ladies. There was Mrs. Schmidt, who was from Germany and was really nice, but didn't speak much English, just German, and she would teach me German words while we traveled. And there was Miss Harriet, who was younger and sang songs to keep us cheerful when the road got really bumpy and rough and we were all tired and sore. The driver was a man named Mr. Hobbs. He was so kind to me. He let me sit up front sometimes and hold the reins, even though Mama said I was too little and might get hurt. He told me stories about when he was young and drove wagons all the way to California during the gold rush. Her voice wavered dangerously, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks again. But she kept going. We were supposed to meet our new husbands in a town called Mercury Falls. Mr. Hobbs said we'd be there in just 2 more days. We were so close. But yesterday afternoon, these men came riding up really fast from behind us, their horses kicking up huge clouds of dust. They wore bandanas over their faces, so we couldn't see who they were. They rode up alongside the wagon, and one of them shouted at Mr. Hobbs to stop. Mr. Hobbs started to pull on the reins, but then he reached for his rifle that he kept under the seat, and that's when they shot him. She dissolved into sobs, the words coming out broken and jagged. They just shot him like he was nothing, and he fell off the seat and hit the ground so hard, and there was blood everywhere, and his eyes were open, but he wasn't moving, and I knew he was dead. Delson felt his hands tighten involuntarily, his jaw clenching hard enough that his teeth ached. He forced himself to relax, to stay calm, to not let his rage show and frighten this child further. What happened to the other women, to Mrs. Schmidt and Miss Harriet? Daisy wiped at her streaming eyes with the edge of the blanket, leaving wet streaks across the rough wool. Mrs. Schmidt tried to jump off the wagon and run into the bushes, but they rode after her like she was a rabbit and they were hunting for sport. I heard her screaming, but I couldn't see what happened. Miss Harriet was crying and begging them to let us go, and they hit her across the face to make her stop, and she fell down in the wagon bed. They pulled Mama down by her hair and tied her hands behind her back, with rope tied them so tight that she cried out in pain. She kept fighting them, even with her hands tied, kicking at them and trying to bite them. And she was so brave. One of them grabbed me by my dress and started to lift me onto his horse. But Mama kicked his horse really hard in the belly, and it reared up on its back legs, and he had to let go of me to hold on, and I fell in the dirt. Fresh sobs racked her small body. Mama shouted at me to run and hide under the wagon and not come out no matter what I heard, and I crawled under there and held my breath and watched through the wheel spokes. They put Mama and Miss Harriet on horses, and I think Mrs. Schmidt was already on one too, but I couldn't see her. Then there was shouting from far away. Maybe someone saw the smoke or heard the shot, and the men got scared and rode away really fast toward the west. I waited and waited under that wagon until I couldn't hear the horses anymore, and everything was quiet except for the flies buzzing, and then you came. She looked up at Delson with those devastating gray eyes that had seen far too much for someone so young. Why did they take Mama but leave me? Don't they know I need her? Don't they know she needs me? They left you because you were not what they wanted, Delson said gently, choosing truth over comforting lies because children deserve truth, even when it hurt. They wanted women they could sell or force to work. A child would slow them down and bring attention they did not want. But that does not mean they are not evil men, Daisy. They are very evil, and they will answer for what they have done. I promise you that. He stood and walked to the edge of the firelight, staring out into the darkness, where the Rio Verde murmured over stones in its endless journey, where night birds called and insects sang, and the world continued on, indifferent to human suffering. Nayeli joined him. After a moment, her voice pitched low, so the others would not hear, so private that it was almost intimate in its intensity. You think this is connected to what happened to Winona? You think she's caught up in this same nightmare? It was not a question. Nayeli had been with him long enough to understand how his mind worked, how he pieced together fragments of information into patterns that others missed, how he saw connections where others saw only random events. I know it is, Delson said quietly, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion that threatened to overwhelm him if he let it. The drunk in Tucson talked about Phantom Ridge Mine. The contract I found in the wagon was for Mercury Falls. 3 months ago, I heard a rumor that the Indian agent who took Winona, a man named Bingham, was seen near Phantom Ridge. These are not coincidences, cousin. Someone is running an organized operation. They take women off the bridal company routes and children off the orphan trains and from reservations. They move them through the territories to places where no one asks questions, where people disappear all the time. And it doesn't matter because nobody cares about the missing. Places like Phantom Ridge Mine. Then we go to the mine, Nayeli said, her voice carrying cold determination. And we burn it to the ground if we have to. Yes, Delson agreed. But first, we need to get Daisy somewhere safe. Somewhere the posse will not find her, and we will not have to worry about protecting her while we hunt these men. Dr. Emmett mentioned a mission station run by Franciscans 3 days north near the San Pedro River. They take in children and ask no questions. 3 days? Nayeli said, frustration sharp in her voice. That's 3 days we're not tracking these men. 3 days the trail goes cold and Alice Koenig gets farther away or ends up dead like Mrs. Schmidt. The trail is already cold, Delson said, frustration matching hers. And I cannot track properly while protecting a child and watching for a posse and trying not to get us all killed. If they catch us with her, they will hang me from the nearest tree without a trial, and she will end up in an orphanage or worse. We have no choice. The argument hung heavy in the air between them, tension crackling like lightning about to strike. Finally, Emmett approached his medical bag in hand, his voice carrying the weight of years spent making impossible decisions in situations where there were no good options. I will take her to San Pedro, he said firmly, looking from Delson to Nayeli and back again. You two move faster alone, and you're less likely to be stopped or questioned. I know the way to the mission. I've sent patients there before when they had nowhere else to go. An old white doctor traveling with a child will raise no suspicion. People will assume she's my granddaughter or a patient I'm escorting to family. But an Apache warrior with a white child, it's a hanging offense waiting to happen, no trial needed. Delson studied the older man's face, seeing the determination there beneath the exhaustion, seeing something else too. A need to do something good, to save someone for once, instead of watching them die. You are certain this could be dangerous if the wrong people ask the wrong questions. I am more certain of this than I have been of anything in 10 years, Emmett said. His voice held an edge of desperation, of needing this to matter. You saved this child from that wreckage when you could have ridden past. You made her a promise. Now let me help you keep it. Let me do something that matters for once, instead of just patching up wounds and watching good people suffer. They broke camp well before dawn, the sky still dark, but beginning to gray at the eastern edge. Emmett would take Daisy north to San Pedro Mission, a journey of perhaps 3 or 4 days if they traveled carefully. Delson and Nayeli would ride hard west, following the tracks before wind and time erased them completely, before the trail went so cold it could never be found again. The farewell was brief but heavy with emotion that none of them quite knew how to express. Daisy clung to Delson's leg, her small face tilted up to look at him in the gray, pre-dawn light, her eyes enormous and afraid. "You promised," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "You promised you would find Mama and bring her back to me. You can't break your promise. Please don't break it." Delson knelt down, slowly bringing himself to her level one last time, and reached into his shirt. He pulled out a small leather cord, strung with a single turquoise bead, the only thing he had left from his mother, worn smooth by years of being carried close to his heart. His mother had given it to him on her deathbed, pressed it into his palm with her last strength, and told him it would keep him safe and remind him who he was. He tied it carefully around Daisy's thin wrist, his fingers gentle despite their roughness and the urgency thrumming through him. "I keep my promises," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he did not try to hide. "Always. No matter how long it takes or how hard it gets. This is so you remember that, so you have something of mine to hold on to. When I find your Mama and I will find her Daisy, I swear it on everything I hold sacred. I will bring her to San Pedro Mission. Dr. Emmett will keep you safe until then. He is a good man, and he will protect you with his life. Do you understand?" Daisy nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks and dripping off her chin, making dark spots on her dress. She reached into her own dress with trembling hands and pulled out the cloth doll, now dry but still bearing the marks of its journey through the creek. She pressed it into Delson's hands with both of hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "You keep this," she said, her voice fierce despite the tears. "So you remember your promise. So you remember me. So you come back and don't forget about us." Delson looked down at the doll with its button eyes and stitched smile, one arm hanging loose from the soaking it had taken, and something twisted painfully deep in his chest, in a place he had thought was already too scarred to feel new pain. He tucked it carefully into his saddlebag, treating it with the reverence he would give a sacred object, then placed his hand on Daisy's head one last time, feeling the warmth of her, the fragility, the trust she was placing in him. "I will come back," he said, and it was both promise and prayer. "With your Mama, I give you my word." Then he swung into the saddle in one smooth motion, born of long practice, and he and Nayeli rode west into the rising sun, leaving Emmett and Daisy behind as they turned their horses north toward San Pedro. Delson did not look back, because he knew if he looked back, he might not be able to leave, and leaving was the only way to keep his promise. Behind him, he heard Daisy call his name, once her voice small and breaking, and then she went quiet. They rode in silence for the first hour, putting distance between themselves and the camp, moving fast through country that was growing rougher with each mile. Finally, Nayeli spoke, her voice carefully neutral. "You care for that child." "She reminds me of Winona," Delson said simply. "Before everything happened, before Bingham took her, before the world taught her that promises mean nothing and adults cannot be trusted and hope is just another word for pain. Aberrance, and if we find Winona, and she is not the sister you remember, if she has changed too much." Delson was quiet for a long moment, watching the trail ahead. "Then I will love who she has become, instead of mourning who she was. And I will make sure she knows that she was not forgotten, that someone came looking, that she mattered enough for someone to search for 2 years and never give up. That has to count for something, cousin. It has to." Nayeli nodded slowly, understanding in her dark eyes. They rode on as the sun climbed higher and the day grew hot, following tracks that were growing fainter with each passing hour, but were still there if you knew where to look and how to read them. The trail led west for 2 days of hard riding, following the railroad line at a distance, but never straying far from it. Delson and Nayeli rode from first light until darkness made tracking impossible. stopping only to water the horses and study the ground with intense concentration. The trail was fading badly now. Wind had blurred the edges, and in places where the ground turned to solid rock, they lost it entirely for stretches that sometimes lasted hours. But Delson had tracked wounded elk through snow and hunted men across desert hardpan. And he knew how to read the small signs that others would miss and dismiss as random, a horseshoe scrape on a boulder where iron had met stone at speed, leaving a faint mark like chalk on slate. A broken sage branch hanging at an unnatural angle that indicated recent passage. The faint depression in sand where a hoof had pressed deep and been partially filled by wind, but not completely. Not yet. Disturbed stones that showed paler undersides when kicked over, meaning something had passed this way within the last day or two. On the afternoon of the second day, they found something that made Delson's blood run cold and confirmed his worst fears about what they were hunting. Nayeli spotted it first, a depression in the ground, about 50 yards from the tracks, partially hidden by a cluster of boulders. The earth had been disturbed recently, stones piled in a way that was not natural, that spoke of human hands working quickly and without care. They dismounted and approached cautiously, and when Delson began moving the stones aside with his hands, he found what he had dreaded finding. A woman lay in a shallow grave, her body already beginning to smell in the heat despite the hasty burial. Her hands were still bound behind her back, with rope that had cut into her wrists hard enough to leave deep marks in the swollen flesh. Her throat had been cut with brutal efficiency, one deep slash that had nearly severed her head, done by someone who knew exactly where to cut and how deep. Her dress was torn, and there were bruises on her arms and face signs of struggle and violence that had preceded her death. "Mrs. Schmidt," Delson said quietly, his voice tight with controlled fury. He recognized the description Daisy had given the German woman who had tried to run, who had taught Daisy German words during the journey, who had been kind. She tried to escape. Or maybe she fought too hard. Or maybe she was just unlucky enough to be the one they decided to use as a warning to the others about what happens to women who don't cooperate. Nayeli's face was hard as stone, all emotion locked away behind walls of self-control learned through years of survival. They killed her and dumped her like garbage, like she was nothing, like her life meant nothing at all. To them, she was nothing, Delson said bitterly. Just merchandise that became too much trouble. Easier to kill her and leave her for the scavengers than waste time and effort controlling her. He began covering the body again with stones, working methodically, despite the fury building in his chest. "We will report this, eventually tell the authorities where to find her so she can have a proper burial. But I doubt they will care much about a German immigrant woman with no family and no money to pay for their time and effort." "Will they care about Alice Koenig?" Nayeli asked. "No," Delson said flatly. "But Daisy will, and I will. And that will have to be enough." They rode on the discovery, lending new urgency to their pace and new rage to their determination. The men they were hunting were not just thieves or even slavers. They were killers who thought nothing of murder, who would discard human lives as easily as throwing away broken tools. That evening, as they made a cold camp in a cluster of boulders with no fire to mark their position, Nayeli finally voiced the question that had been hanging between them, like smoke. "What if Winona is already dead? What if we get to this mine and find nothing but more shallow graves? What if we've been chasing a ghost for 2 years? Delson was silent for a long moment, staring up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried absolute conviction. "Then I will know. I will have certainty instead of this constant not knowing that eats at me every day. And I will burn that place to the ground with everyone in it. And I will make sure that no one else loses a sister or mother or daughter to these men. Winona will be the last one they take, even if I have to die making sure of it." And if she is alive, but changed beyond recognition, if she has been broken or has learned to survive by becoming someone you don't recognize, then I will still love her. Delson said simply, I will love who she has become instead of mourning who she was. I will make sure she knows she was not forgotten, that someone came looking, that she mattered enough for someone to search for 2 years and never stop. That has to mean something, cousin. It has to count for something in this world where so little counts for anything at all. Nayeli nodded slowly, understanding in her dark eyes. She had lost her own sister and knew about the weight of survivors' guilt about promises made to the dead that could never truly be fulfilled, but had to be pursued anyway. On the morning of the 3rd day, they reached the town whose name had been on Alice Koenig's contract, Mercury Falls. The name was a bitter joke. There were no falls here, no water at all, except for a dry creek bed that might run during spring floods, but was now just cracked mud and scattered stones. The town clung to a rocky hillside, like a dying thing refusing to let go, a collection of perhaps 15 weathered buildings that looked ready to collapse into kindling at the next strong wind. Most were clearly abandoned doors, hanging open on broken hinges, windows empty of glass roofs caved in. Sage grew in the streets and tumbleweeds piled against walls. But one building at the center of town showed signs of recent use, a squat structure built of stone with barred windows and a faded sign above the door that read, Mercury Falls Bridal Company, in letters that had once been gold but were now mostly flaked away. They approached cautiously as the sun climbed toward noon, leaving the horses tied in a copse of stunted cottonwoods half a mile out and moving on foot through the broken ground. The building appeared dark and empty, but fresh wagon ruts led to the rear entrance ruts that could not be more than a few days old at most. Someone had been here recently. Delson tried the front door, found it locked, and moved around to examine a side window. The frame was rotten with age and desert dryness. He worked his knife blade into the crack and levered gently. The wood gave way with barely a sound, falling away in chunks, and he climbed through into darkness. Nayeli followed close behind her rifle, ready, moving with the silent grace that had earned her the nickname Shadow among their people. Inside, the air was thick with dust and smelled of old paper and something else, smoke, recent smoke. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the walls and roof, illuminating a room filled with overturned furniture and scattered documents. Someone had left in a hurry or had been searching for something specific and had torn the place apart in the process. Nayeli lit a small candle she carried, shielding the flame carefully with her hand so it would not be visible from outside. By its flickering light, they searched methodically and in silence. Most of the papers were routine business correspondence contracts between Mercury Falls Bridal Company and Women Back East, receipts for train tickets, letters from women inquiring about the service and what to expect. But in a locked drawer of a heavy desk that Delson pried open with his knife, they found something that made his hands shake and his vision narrow with rage so intense it was almost blinding. A ledger. Heavy, leather-bound, filled with neat columns of handwriting in brown ink. Page after page of names, ages, origins, destinations, and prices. Women from all over the eastern states, Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, Massachusetts, Virginia, all promised husbands in towns with names like Mercury Falls and Silver Creek and Redemption and Last Chance. But beside many of the names was a notation written in different ink, added later, redirected, Phantom Ridge MC, or transferred, special contract PR, or simply PR. Dadis. Delson flipped through the pages with trembling hands, his chest tight, barely able to breathe. The entries went back 3 years. Dozens of women, maybe 100 or more. All sold, all disappeared into a system that treated them as commodities instead of human beings. And then on a page dated September 1852, he found a separate section that made his heart stop completely. A list of children, 12 names, ages ranging from 6 to 14. Notation at the top, acquired via BIA relocation program. Agent H. Bingham, supervising transfer. 11 names he did not recognize, Apache children from San Carlos Reservation, some from other tribes, one Navajo girl. The 12th name was Winona, his sister. Beside her name in the same neat handwriting, age 14, healthy, literate English. Assigned to Phantom Ridge Mine, domestic service. Payment received $75. That was what his sister had been worth to these men. $75 for a 14-year-old girl who could read and write, who had trusted that the government agent taking her away was going to educate her and give her opportunities she could never have on the reservation. $75 to sell her into slavery. Delson's vision blurred with rage and grief so intense he could not distinguish between them. His hands clenched on the ledger so hard the leather creaked and pages crumpled. Beside him, Nayeli had gone very still, reading over his shoulder, her breath coming sharp and fast. "Delson," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the red haze filling his mind. "Look at the signature. Look who authorized all these transactions." At the bottom of each page, in bold, slashing handwriting, was a signature Harold Bingham, Indian Agent, San Carlos Reservation, Authorized Representative Bureau of Indian Affairs. The same man who had come to their camp 2 years ago with papers and promises. The same man who had loaded Winona into that wagon. The same man who had knocked Delson down with a rifle butt when he tried to stop them. He was not just an agent following orders or a bureaucrat doing his job. He was part of this, profiting from it, selling the children he was supposed to protect into slavery and pocketing $75 per child. "He is at the mine." Delson said, his voice cold and hard as winter stone, devoid of all emotion, because he had gone past emotion into something colder and more dangerous. "He has to be. He is running this whole operation from there." "Then we go to the mine," Nayeli said, matching his tone. "And we end this. Tonight. We end it all." They took the ledger and several other incriminating documents and left Mercury Falls behind them. As they rode away, Nayeli turned in her saddle and hurled her torch through the window of the bridal company building. The old dry wood caught immediately, flames licking up the walls with hungry speed. By the time they reached their horses, the entire building was ablaze, flames spreading to neighboring structures. By the time they were a mile away, the whole town was burning, sending a column of black smoke into the clear blue sky that could be seen for miles. Delson did not look back. He was done with half measures and caution and trying to work within a system that was designed to protect men like Bingham. The time for restraint was over. Bingham had stolen his sister and sold her like livestock. Now Delson would find him, and there would be a reckoning that had been 2 years in coming. Phantom Ridge Mine sat in a box canyon 12 miles west of Mercury Falls, a fortress carved into the mountain by greed and watered with the blood and sweat of the desperate. The only approach was a single wagon road that wound through broken country where ambush was easy and escape nearly impossible, where the rock walls pressed close on both sides and a handful of men with rifles could hold off an army. The mine itself looked like something from a nightmare, stone buildings built against the canyon walls, guard towers flanking the entrance, with armed men visible even from a distance, and the constant sound of hammering echoing off the rock walls like the heartbeat of some great mechanical beast. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and the air tasted of coal dust and human misery. Delson and Nayeli watched from a ridge above the canyon for 2 full days and nights, taking turns sleeping while the other kept watch, studying every detail of the mine's operations. They counted at least 20 armed guards on rotating shifts, and probably more inside the buildings where they could not be seen. A direct assault would be suicide. Two people, no matter how skilled or determined, could not fight their way through that many guns and hope to survive long enough to find anyone, let alone escape with prisoners. But Delson had not survived this long by being reckless or by charging straight at problems. He had survived by being patient, by watching, by finding the weaknesses others overlooked because they were too obvious or too well hidden. On the second night, as clouds moved in from the west and blocked the moon, he found what he was looking for, a ventilation shaft on the north face of the canyon wall, partially hidden by a cluster of scrub pine that had somehow found purchase in the barren rock. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through if he turned sideways and did not breathe too deep, but it led down into the mine workings. Smoke drifted from it in thin wisps, meaning it was still in use, still connected to the tunnels below. They waited until the darkest hour before dawn, when the guards were tired and cold, and attention wandered to thoughts of warm beds and hot coffee. Then they moved with the silence that had kept their people alive for generations in a land that showed no mercy to the careless. The climb down the canyon face was treacherous, in the dark, loose rock shifting under their hands and feet, threatening to send them tumbling to their deaths on the rocks far below. Twice Delson nearly fell, catching himself at the last moment with fingers digging into cracks in the stone arms, screaming with strain. But they reached the ventilation shaft without being spotted, and Delson squeezed inside. First, his shoulders scraping rock on both sides, his chest compressed so tightly he could barely draw breath. The shaft dropped at a steep angle into absolute darkness, so complete it felt solid, the air thick with the smell of dust and old smoke, and something else, fear maybe, or despair, the accumulated suffering of people trapped underground with no hope of escape. Delson moved by feel alone, his hands scraping rock that was sometimes smooth and sometimes jagged, his shoulders pressed against the narrow walls hard enough to leave bruises. Behind him, he could hear Nayeli's breathing, quick and controlled, and the soft sounds of her descent. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 minutes, the shaft leveled out and widened slightly, becoming a tunnel tall enough to crouch in, but not stand. Faint light filtered from somewhere ahead, lamplight flickering in orange, and speaking of human habitation. Delson moved toward it with infinite caution, every sense alert, every nerve straining to detect danger before it detected him. The shaft opened into a side tunnel of the main mine workings, a passage carved from living rock with timber supports holding up the ceiling and rail tracks running along the floor for ore carts. The tunnel was empty at this hour, but Delson could hear voices echoing from somewhere deeper in the mine. Men talking and laughing, the clink of bottles, the rough camaraderie of guards relaxing between shifts. He and Nayeli moved like ghosts along the tunnel, keeping to the deepest shadows where lamplight did not reach, freezing motionless whenever a sound grew closer. They passed storage rooms filled with tools and crates stamped with powder marks, a kitchen where a solitary man dozed by a cast-iron stove with his chair tilted back against the wall, and finally reached a section where the tunnels branched in multiple directions. Delson chose the branch that led deeper into the mountain, following his instincts, and the faint sounds of movement, shuffling feet, whispered voices, the clank of chains. After perhaps 100 yards, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and there, behind a barred door with lamplight spilling beneath it, he found what he had been searching for. The room beyond was large, perhaps 30 feet across, carved from living rock with a ceiling supported by massive timber beams. A dozen women sat or lay on rough blankets spread across the stone floor, their clothes torn and filthy, their faces gaunt and hollow with exhaustion and despair. Some slept fitfully. Others stared at nothing, their eyes empty of hope or even the memory of hope. And there near the back wall, sitting with her knees drawn up to her chest and her arms wrapped around them, was Alice Koenig. She was thinner than in the photograph Daisy had shown him. Her blonde hair chopped short and uneven, as if someone had hacked at it with a knife. Her lips split in swollen bruises fading to yellow-green on her cheek and jaw. But her eyes were still clear when they met his through the bars, still defiant, still holding on to something that years of suffering had not quite extinguished. For a moment she stared at him, uncomprehending her mind, unable to process the sight of an Apache warrior crouching in the shadows outside her prison. Then recognition dawned, not of him specifically, but of what he represented. Hope. Rescue. Someone who had come. Delson worked quickly on the door's lock with the tip of his knife, his hand steady despite the urgency thrumming through his veins and the pounding of his heart. The lock was crude, designed to keep desperate women in, rather than determined rescuers, out a simple bolt mechanism that gave way after perhaps 30 seconds of careful manipulation. He eased the door open, the hinges creaking softly, a sound that seemed deafeningly loud in the quiet of the mine. He raised one finger to his lips, signaling silence, then whispered, "Alice Koenig." She stood slowly, her movement stiff with pain or injury, and crossed to the door with careful steps. "Who are you?" She whispered back, her voice hoarse from disuse or screaming. "My name is Delson. Your daughter sent me. Daisy is safe with a doctor at San Pedro Mission. I promised her I would find you and bring you back to her." Alice's face crumpled and tears spilled over, tracking through the dirt on her cheeks. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a sob. "Daisy, she is truly alive. She is safe. They told me she was dead, that I would never see her again, that I should forget about her." "She is alive and waiting for you," Delson said firmly. "But we need to move now. Can you walk? Can you run if needed?" "I can fly if it means getting out of this hell," Alice said fiercely, strength returning to her voice. She turned to the other women, some of whom had begun to stir and take notice. "Get up, all of you. We are leaving this place. Now. Tonight." Some of the women did not move, too broken or too afraid to believe escape was possible, conditioned by months or years of captivity to accept their fate. But 6 others stood, including a young Mexican woman who moved to Alice's side with determined steps. "There are children too," Alice whispered urgently to Delson, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "In another room deeper in the mine, in what they call the domestic quarters. We cannot leave them behind. I will not leave them. If you try to make me go without them, I will scream and bring every guard in this place down on us." Delson's chest tightened painfully. More people meant more risk, more chance of discovery, more likelihood that they would all die here in the dark. But he thought of Daisy clutching her doll and offering all her toys for her mother's life. And he thought of Winona reaching through canvas toward him, and he knew there was only one answer he could give. "Where?" he asked simply. "Deeper, past the foreman's quarters. There is a room where they keep the children who work in the mine or in the house. Please, we cannot leave them." "I will find them," Delson promised. He looked at Nayeli, who had been standing watch in the tunnel. "Get these women out through the ventilation shaft. I will find the children and meet you at the ridge." "This is a mistake." Nayeli hissed, her voice sharp with frustration and fear. "We should all leave now while we still can. Every minute we stay is another minute they can discover us. I am not leaving children here," Delson said flatly, his tone brooking no argument. "Get the women out. I will get the children. If I do not make it, you make sure they do. That is an order, cousin." Nayeli's jaw tightened with anger and worry, but she nodded sharply. She knew better than to argue when Delson had that look in his eyes, knew that some things mattered more than survival, that some promises had to be kept, regardless of cost. As Nayeli began leading the women back toward the ventilation shaft, moving as quickly and quietly as the exhausted women could manage, Delson moved deeper into the mine. The tunnels branched and intersected in a maze that would have confused anyone unfamiliar with such places. But Delson had hunted in caves and tracked through canyons that branched 100 times, and he had learned to map spaces in his mind as he moved through them. He followed the sounds of habitation and the creak of floorboards overhead, the murmur of voices, the smell of wood smoke and cooking food. He found the children's room adjacent to what appeared to be living quarters. For whoever ran this operation, a door marked Foreman in white paint lamplight, visible through the crack beneath it. The children's door was secured with a simple bolt on the outside. Delson slid it back carefully and eased the door open. 10 children looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes that reflected lamplight like animals caught in the dark. They ranged in age from perhaps 6 to 13, most Apache, but also 2 white children, a boy and a girl, and a Navajo boy, with his hair cut short in the white style. They slept on thin blankets spread across the hard stone floor, and when Delson opened the door, several woke immediately with the instant alertness of people who have learned that sleep offers no safety. "I am here to take you out of this place," Delson whispered in Apache, then repeated it in English. "But you must be absolutely silent, not a sound, not a word. If they hear us, they will kill us all. Do you understand?" A girl of about 10, with Apache features and scars on her arms, nodded slowly. She looked at him with ancient eyes that had seen too much, suffered too much, and now expected nothing but more pain. When she spoke, her voice was flat and dead. "Are you looking for someone specific, or are you really here for all of us?" "All of you," Delson said. "But yes, I am also looking for my sister. Winona. Is she here?" The girl pointed to a figure sleeping in the corner, separated slightly from the others. "She works in the house during the day. She will not want to leave. She never wants anything anymore." Delson's heart clenched painfully. He moved to the corner and knelt beside the sleeping form. And even in the dim light from the single lamp in the hallway, even after 2 years of imagining this moment, he would have known her anywhere. Winona, his sister. But the girl who stirred and opened her eyes was not the girl he remembered. That Winona had been curious and bright and quick to laugh, had loved stories and songs and watching birds in flight. This Winona looked at him with flat, dead eyes that showed no recognition, no emotion, nothing at all. When he whispered her name, she flinched as if he had struck her. "Winona, it's me. It's Delson. I have come to take you home. I have searched for you for 2 years. I never stopped looking. I kept my promise to Mother. We are leaving. Now. There is no home," she said in a voice like ashes and dust, like something that had burned away long ago and left only char behind. "There is only here. There is always only here. If you try to take me away, he will find me. He always finds the ones who run. He found 3 others and brought them back and made examples of them, and we had to watch, and I will not go through that again. Go away. Leave me alone." "Who?" Delson demanded, though he already knew the answer. "Who will find you?" "Agent Bingham," Winona said, and there was no emotion in her voice, just flat acceptance of a terrible truth. "He brought me here. He owns me. He owns all of us. He said we belong to him now, and the government gave him the right to do whatever he wants with us, and no one will ever come looking because no one cares what happens to Indian children." The words hit Delson like physical blows, each one landing with the force of a fist. He reached for Winona's hand, but she pulled away, and the rejection hurt worse than any wound he had ever taken in battle. "Winona, please," he said, his voice breaking despite his efforts to stay strong. "I care. I have been looking for you every day for 2 years. I have ridden thousands of miles. I have followed every rumor and every whisper. I made a promise to our mother that I would find you and keep you safe. And I am keeping that promise now. Come with me. Please. I will protect you. I swear it on everything I hold sacred." Before she could answer, Before he could say more, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, heavy boots, multiple men moving fast and purposefully. Someone had discovered the empty cell, or the missing guards, or seen something that did not belong. Discovery was imminent. "They know," the 10-year-old girl whispered, her eyes going wide with terror born of experience. "They always know eventually. We have to run now or die here." Delson made a decision in a heartbeat. He grabbed Winona's arm gently but firmly enough that she could not easily pull away, and hauled her to her feet. "We go now, all of you. Stay close and stay silent." He led them out of the room and down the corridor away from the approaching footsteps, following his mental map back toward the main shaft entrance, because the ventilation shaft was too narrow and too slow for 10 children to climb. Behind them, shouts erupted as the men discovered the empty room. Lanterns swung wildly, casting crazy shadows that danced on the walls like demons. Delson ran the children stumbling after him, some helping others who were too weak or too young to keep pace. They reached a junction, and he turned left, following the slope downward toward what he hoped was the main chamber, the central hub from which all the other tunnels branched. They burst out of a side tunnel into the main chamber of the mine, a vast cavern perhaps 100 feet across with a ceiling lost in shadow, high above, lit by dozens of lanterns hanging from hooks driven into the rock walls and timber supports. And there, standing in the center of the chamber with a rifle in his hands and a look of cold fury on his weathered face, was Harold Bingham. He was older than Delson remembered from that morning 2 years ago, his hair graying at the temples and his face more lined, but the eyes were the same, cold, calculating, the eyes of a man who had learned to see people as commodities, to be bought and sold and used, until they broke. "I should have killed you 2 years ago when you tried to chase down that wagon," Bingham said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. He raised the rifle with practiced ease, aiming it at Delson's chest. "When you came running after us like a rabid dog, would have saved me considerable trouble and expense. But I thought you would give up like all the others. I thought you would learn your place and accept what cannot be changed." "You sold her," Delson said, his voice shaking with rage so intense it threatened to choke him. "You sold your own people, children you were supposed to protect and educate and help. You sold Winona for $75. You sold all of them. And she was worth every penny," Bingham said with a thin, cruel smile that did not reach his eyes. "Good worker once she learned obedience. Literate, which made her more valuable. They all become obedient eventually, you know. The ones who don't?" He shrugged. "Well, there are always more where they came from. The reservation produces an endless supply." Behind Delson, he heard Winona make a small, broken sound that was not quite a sob, not quite a scream, something worse than either. "You are going to let us leave," Delson said, his hand moving slowly toward the knife at his belt. "All of us. Every woman, every child. Or I will kill you where you stand and burn this place to ash." Bingham laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the stone. "You and what army savage you are outnumbered 20-1. Even if you could somehow fight your way out, which you cannot possibly do, where would you go? The law will not help you. The law works for me, protects men like me. I am the law out here in this territory. I have the authorization of the federal government. I have papers and seals and signatures. What do you have? Nothing but empty threats and broken promises." "Then there will be no law," Delson said quietly. "Only justice." He moved before Bingham could react, closing the distance between them with blinding speed, born of desperation and 2 years of pent-up rage. The rifle fired the shot, deafening in the enclosed space, echoing like thunder. But Delson had already dropped low and rolled the bullet, passing through the space where his chest had been a moment before, and striking sparks off the stone wall behind him. He came up inside Bingham's guard and slammed into him, driving them both to the hard stone floor. The rifle clattered away across the floor, spinning into darkness. They grappled and rolled, each fighting for advantage hands, seeking throats and eyes and any vulnerable point. Bingham was older but heavier, and fought with the desperate strength of a man who knew he was fighting for his life. Knew that if he lost this fight, he would not live to see morning. He got his hands around Delson's throat, squeezing with surprising strength, cutting off air. Delson's vision started to gray at the edges, black spots dancing in his sight. He could hear Winona screaming his name somewhere far away. Could hear boots pounding as guards rushed into the chamber. From multiple tunnels could hear the metallic click of rifles being cocked. His hand scrabbled at his belt, fingers closing on the hilt of his knife. With the last of his strength, with consciousness slipping away like water through his fingers, he drew it and drove it upward into Bingham's side, below the ribs, angling up toward the heart. Bingham gasped, his grip loosening. His eyes went wide with shock and pain and disbelief. Blood spread across his shirt in a dark stain that looked black in the lamplight. Delson shoved him off with a surge of adrenaline and rolled away, gasping for air, his throat on fire. The guards were almost on them, rifles raised, fingers on triggers. Delson grabbed for Bingham's fallen rifle, but knew he would not reach it in time, knew this was where it ended after 2 years of searching. Then Nayeli appeared from a side tunnel, like an avenging spirit, her own rifle raised. She fired once without hesitation, the shot taking the nearest guard in the chest and dropping him like a stone. The other guards scattered, seeking cover behind ore carts and timber supports. "The women are out," Nayeli shouted over the sudden chaos of gunfire. "But half the mine is coming. We need to go now." "The children." Delson rasped, his throat bruised and aching. He pointed at the group cowering against the wall, Winona among them. "I see them. Move." They ran for the main entrance, the children streaming after them in a ragged line, some helping others who were too weak or too frightened to run properly. Behind them, guards poured into the chamber from multiple tunnels, shouting and firing wildly in the confusion and poor light. Bullets ricocheted off stone walls with sharp cracks and whines sending chips of rock flying like shrapnel. They burst out into the pre-dawn darkness, the sky just beginning to gray at the eastern edge. Horses were waiting where Nayeli had left them, and beyond them, Delson could see Alice and the other women clustered together, alive and free. "Take the children and the women," Delson ordered. "Ride for the ridge. Do not stop for anything. I am going to make sure they cannot follow." "Delson, no," Alice shouted, but he was already turning back toward the mine entrance. Stacked beside the entrance were dozens of crates stamped with black powder warnings, explosives for blasting new tunnels, enough powder to bring down the entire canyon face if set off properly. Delson grabbed one of the lanterns hanging by the entrance and hurled it with all his strength into the nearest crate. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the powder caught with a roar that shook the ground and sent a column of flame 50 feet into the air. The explosion was massive, a wall of fire and smoke and concussive force that knocked Delson off his feet and sent him tumbling across the ground. Secondary explosions erupted as other powder stores ignited, each one adding to the chaos. The support timbers at the mine entrance caught fire, and deep within, the earth came a groaning, rumbling sound as tunnels began to collapse under their own weight. Delson staggered to his feet, ears ringing, vision blurred by smoke and dust. He ran for his horse and vaulted into the saddle, spurring after the fleeing women and children. Behind him, Phantom Ridge Mine collapsed in on itself, with a sound like the end of the world, flames licking up into the dawn sky, and black smoke boiling upward in a column visible for miles. They rode hard for the ridge, not stopping until they were miles away, and the sounds of destruction had faded behind them. Only then did Delson allow himself to slow, to check that everyone had made it, to count heads and assess injuries. Winona sat on a horse behind one of the rescued women, staring at nothing with those same dead eyes. But she was alive. She was free. And she was with him again. Alice found him and gripped his arm with both hands, her face fierce despite her exhaustion and injuries. "You kept your promise. You saved us. How do I thank you for that? How do I ever thank you enough?" "By living," Delson said simply. "By going back to Daisy and holding her and building a life worth living. That is thanks enough." The journey to San Pedro Mission took 6 days, moving slowly to accommodate the injured and traumatized. Delson and Nayeli ranged ahead and behind, watching for pursuit that never came. Phantom Ridge Mine was gone, buried under tons of rock, and whatever records or evidence it had contained were ashes now. They moved through country that grew gradually gentler, the harsh desert giving way to grassland, and then to the cottonwood-lined river valleys of the San Pedro. On the 6th day in late afternoon, with the sun painting everything gold, they saw the white walls of the mission rising above the trees. Daisy was sitting on the steps of the chapel with Dr. Emmett mending the arm of her cloth doll with needle and thread. The moment she looked up and saw them coming, saw the group of riders approaching, she dropped the doll and stood frozen for a heartbeat that seemed to last forever. Then she saw her mother. She saw Alice, thin and battered, but alive and real, and riding toward her. "Mama!" Daisy screamed, her voice cracking with the force of it. She leapt off the steps and ran, her small legs pumping as fast as they could, her arms outstretched. "Mama, Mama!" Alice dismounted before her horse had fully stopped and dropped to her knees, arms open. Daisy crashed into her with enough force to knock them both backward onto the ground. They clung to each other and sobbed, both talking at once in a tumble of words that made no sense individually, but perfect sense together. "I thought you were dead, and I was so scared, and I never stopped hoping, and you're here, you're really here, and I love you, I love you, I love you." Delson watched from horseback and felt the crushing weight that had been pressing on his chest for 6 days finally lift. He had kept his promise. He had brought Daisy's mother back to her. The Franciscan brothers came out led by an elderly priest with kind eyes and gentle hands, who asked no questions but simply began organizing food and shelter and medical care for the refugees. Dr. Emmett moved among them with his medical bag, checking the most serious injuries with professional efficiency mixed with obvious relief that they had all survived. Daisy finally broke away from her mother, long enough to run to Delson. She held up her wrist, showing the turquoise bead still tied there with a leather cord. "You came back," she said, her voice awed and joyful and wondering. "You promised, and you came back just like you said." "I keep my promises," Delson said quietly. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the cloth doll, now considerably more damaged from its adventures, but still intact, still recognizable. "And I believe this belongs to you." Daisy took the doll and clutched it to her chest with one arm while throwing the other arm around Delson's leg, squeezing as hard as she could. "Thank you, thank you, thank you. You're a hero. You're my hero. I am just a man who made a promise," Delson said. He gently disentangled himself from her grip and dismounted, kneeling to her level one last time. "Your mother is the hero. She survived, and she never gave up hope. You are a hero too. You were so brave that day when everything went wrong. You did exactly what your mother told you to do, and that saved both your lives." "Are you staying?" Daisy asked, her eyes suddenly fearful. "Please stay. Please don't go. You're family now." Delson glanced at Alice, who stood nearby with one hand resting on Daisy's shoulder. Their eyes met and held, and something passed between them, Not romance, not yet. It was too soon and too raw for that. But understanding, recognition, the bond that forms between people who have survived something terrible together and come out the other side, changed but whole. For a little while, Delson said carefully, until everyone is safe and healed. Then I must go. I have other responsibilities, other people who need me. He looked toward where Winona sat apart from the others, wrapped in a blanket, despite the warmth, staring at nothing. She had not spoken since they left the mine, had not eaten, had barely acknowledged his presence. The sister he had searched for was here in body, but in spirit she was still trapped in that place, still believing she had no value and no future. Alice followed his gaze and understood. She will heal, Alice said quietly, moving to stand beside him. Not quickly, not easily, but she will heal. Time and safety and love work wonders that revenge and anger cannot. You saved her life, Delson. Now she has to learn how to live it again. What if she cannot? What if I found her too late? Then you love her anyway, Alice said simply. You love who she is now instead of mourning who she was before. You be patient and present, and you let her know every single day that she was worth finding, worth saving, worth everything you went through to bring her home. That is all anyone can do. That evening, as the sun set and the mission bells rang for vespers, their sound echoing across the valley, Delson found Winona sitting alone in the mission garden. He sat beside her on a stone bench, not speaking, not touching, just being present the way he had sat with her 1,000 times before, when she was small and frightened of storms, or when she was older and confused about the changing world around them. After a long silence, she finally spoke. Her voice was small and lost, and so fragile it might break at any moment. I do not remember how to be the person I was before all this happened. That girl is gone. She died in that place. Then do not try to be her, Delson said gently. Be the person you are now. Be the person you are becoming. You do not have to be who you were. You just have to be who you are. That is enough for me. It will always be enough. Is it? Her voice was so small, so full of doubt and self-loathing. Even after everything they did, even after everything I became to survive. Especially after all that, Delson said firmly. You are alive, Winona. You survived something that should have destroyed you, but did not. You are stronger than you know. And I will be here beside you for as long as it takes for you to believe that again. Winona leaned against his shoulder, slowly, tentatively, as if testing whether he was real or would vanish like smoke if she reached for him. He wrapped his arm around her carefully, gently, and they sat together in the growing darkness while the mission bells sang their ancient songs. In the distance, Daisy's laughter rang out as she played with the other children, her mother watching with tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, of gratitude, of overwhelming love and joy. That her daughter was safe and they were together again. And the nightmare was finally over. And Delson knew that whatever came next, whatever struggles lay ahead for Winona or for any of them, they would face it together. He had kept his promises to his mother, to Daisy, to himself. He had found Winona. He had saved Alice. He had destroyed the men who had stolen and sold and brutalized innocent people for profit. The cost had been high and the wounds were deep, but they were all alive and they were all free. In the end, that was all anyone could truly ask for in this hard land that showed no mercy to the weak and gave no rewards for virtue. The stars came out one by one, filling the vast western sky with their ancient light. And for the first time in 2 years, Delson felt something close to peace settling over him like a blanket. It was enough. It had to be enough. And for tonight it was.